Okay, I see it's 12:01 by my watch. Ben, are we ready to go?
We're ready to go.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about 3 of the new laws that were signed by Governor Brown relating to reports of lost and stolen firearms, lending firearms, and the possession of magazines that hold over 10 rounds, the misnamed large capacity magazine laws. My name is Chuck Michel. I'm the senior partner of Michel & Associates. I'm going to do the introductory slides here today. Joe Silvoso is the regulatory compliance counsel at Michel & Associates, and he will be talking about the specifics of what these laws do and don't do. There are 2 previous webinars. You can find them at crpa.org/webinars on the other laws that have passed. And there's a couple bills on Jerry Brown's desk today. And if those pass, we'll do webinars on those. So just keep checking back, and I recommend you subscribe at crpa.org for their legislative alerts, because when we do a new webinar, we will put that out. So today's webinar is produced and promoted by CRPA and NRA. The webinar does not cover every single detail. It answers a lot of questions, but we've just been unable to anticipate all the questions we get in every single one. Every single webinar, so we don't cover quite everything. We will incorporate all the information in this webinar, plus all the historical information about all the gun laws in California in the next edition, the 4th edition of the book that Joe and I write, California Gun Laws, A Guide to State and Federal Firearms Regulation. You can pre-order that book now through the CRPA, and we will send you a 60-page sort of a preview covering the bills we're going to talk about today. The California Rifle and Pistol Association, we got a lot of questions about this on the previous webinars. It's the state association for the NRA. CRPA works together with NRA to defend the right to keep and bear arms in Sacramento and in the courts and at locally throughout California. So I encourage everybody to join the fight and join CRPA. I am now the volunteer president of CRPA, and for those of you who may have a impression of what CRPA was from a few years ago, it's an entirely different organization, so give it another look. These are the lawyers on the team that represents both the CRPA and the National Rifle Association in various things that those associations do and have been doing for more than 20 years in California, including legislative advocacy both in Sacramento and locally, monitoring local ordinances that would infringe on your right to keep and bear arms. By the way, we're always looking for information. If you hear about a local ordinance in your area, please let us know so we can oppose it or support it if it's pro-gun. We're also in the Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Game Commission hearings opposing things that would ban hunting or limit hunting in the state of California, and there's a lot of that. The Humane Society of the United States wants to ban hunting entirely across the country, and California is where they're starting. We also fight the DOJ Firearms Bureau for their anti-right to keep and bear arm regulations that they constantly push. And the NRA and CRPA do shooting programs, training programs, and have a fairly significant grassroots volunteers network that does things throughout California. Forgive me for pushing this one hard, but if you're not registered to vote, you're part of the problem in this state. And there's between 8 and 12 million gun owners in California. If 500,000 of them actually voted, we would be able to influence a lot of elections. Many local elections are only decided by a few hundred votes. So your vote really does make a difference. This is information about CRPA and NRA are always looking for volunteers. That's how to get in touch with them for that. If you have general questions about this webinar or anything else, send an email to contact@crpa.org. And if you have an article or something you think should be covered in the CRPA's magazine, there's the address for that. Please go to the crpa.org California Connections page and help us out. Social media has become the primary way to communicate with folks and convince some of those swing voters who may be sitting on the fence about to educate them about some of the lies that the gun ban lobby promotes through their well-orchestrated and well-financed public relations campaigns. The only way we can really fight back against that when the mainstream media is against us is through social media. So by folks on this call who appreciate the right to keep and bear arms, curating and sharing and liking and doing all the other things that you do on Insta, Google, Twitter, Face, the social media platforms, you can really help get the word out. So there is a place to sign up for CRPA's alerts about future webinars. And if you have suggestions about topics that you'd like covered in future webinars, these things have been such a hit. Frankly, we have about over 300 people on the line now. These have been such a hit. We'll do a webinar on almost anything that an NRA or CRPA member requests. It's really not that big of a problem for us to put these webinars together. So we will do a couple of polls throughout this thing, and then we're going to get to the main slides. I know you're all waiting for that, so please help me out here and tell us which of these groups you're a member of. Glad to see everybody's in the NRA. You know, everybody has an opinion about how good or bad of a job the NRA does, but they are by far the 800-pound gorilla in every room. So if you can only afford to join one association, that's the one to join. Thank you, everybody, for responding to that. So this is if you donate politically, how much do you to the cause? How much do you typically give every year? Or in a year. And thank you to all of you who donate, no matter how much you give. Nobody's getting rich. As I said, my position as CRPA president is a volunteer position, and the rates that we charge the NRA for the legal work, I can't even tell my wife because she'd give me a very hard time. But we're in it for the cause. Everybody believes in it, and we spend that money on getting more shooters involved, on doing what we can in Sacramento, and on mobilizing the grassroots and keeping everybody informed. So with that, I'm going to turn this conversation over to Joe Silvoso to actually get into the meat about what these particular bills are going to do for us, or to us. Joe?
Okay. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks everybody for coming by, and thanks to those who have slogged through the first two of these webinars and come back for more depressing news. God help you. But nevertheless, we're back for the third installment of the gun laws that were signed by Governor Brown in the summer, and that we're going to see coming at us in the ensuing year or so. A lot of the ones we had discussed before while these bills all take effect on January 1st, the requirements of them don't extend or go beyond next year. A lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today, probably with the exception of the large cap mags, takes effect January 1st, and we're off and running. And so with large cap mags, we'll be talking about July 1st of next year with the restrictions with respect to those. But we'll be covering those three topics you see in front of you here today: the lending of the firearms bill, the theft loss reporting, or the false theft loss reporting, I should say, and then the restrictions and the now ban on so-called large capacity magazines. And as I've done in all of the previous lectures, I need to do my legal and lawyerly duties by throwing a big disclaimer with a bunch of fine print in front of you before I start. Thankfully, the legislative session is all but done. The bills that are to the governor concerning firearms are there or have been put in suspense, partly because of there was no movement on them. We had suspected and feared potentially that some of the bills that had been passed earlier this year may have been amended by the legislature or broadened by the legislature. I'm hearing an echo in the background. Chuck, I think I've got an echo coming off of one of the speakers you've got me running on there. But nevertheless, and there that goes. Nevertheless, that fear and concern we had that the legislature might have expanded the bills that have already passed has passed, at least for this legislative session. The concern now swings to the California Department of Justice because a lot of these bills will require DOJ to implement regulations before they come into effect, and it remains to be seen the language and what DOJ is going to do concerning their regulations. And then, of course, two other things to be concerned about. We have the Newsom Initiative that gets voted on this coming November that may and potentially will modify, if it passes, some of the things I'll be discussing today even. And then last but not least, we always have to worry about the legislature coming back in session as they do every year and gumming up the works yet again when it comes to California laws and California firearm ownership restrictions and rights. And so there's all of those things to be concerned with. So bear in mind that the things I'm going to be discussing here, as I did the last two times we've discussed these issues, are subject to change, can potentially change. And when in doubt, most certainly your first course of action should be turning to the code itself to figure out what those laws are. And then, of course, if they become too taxing to figure out, contacting an attorney who knows firearm law to assist you with either answering your questions or if you're facing some type of legal repercussions for firearm law. Quite often we have people contacting our office who have tried to go the route of hiring a family friend or somebody they've used in the past for many years concerning their firearms issues, and they find themselves way in over their head, and the person's contacting us because they're now facing some rather serious charges or situations that may have been mitigated or resolved more cleanly if a attorney who is well versed in firearms had been contacted. So just keep all of that in mind. Also, somewhere buried in this fine print is me saying that the laws I'm going to be talking about today I've watered down to some extent for purposes of these slides. If I include all of the exceptions to the restrictions of large capacity magazines, all of the ones that are currently in the law, and even all of the additional ones, we would have 10 slides worth of just text that I would be talking about at length, and you would be bored out of your mind. And so I've summarized a lot of these laws and a lot of these exceptions. So again, if you're concerned about all of these laws and exceptions, I would suggest, again, going to the text itself. And like Chuck has already mentioned, we have a treatise, a 66-page treatise on all of the laws that passed earlier this summer that you can get if you pre-order the California gun laws. And then, of course, if you get to the 4th edition of California gun laws, all of that information will be wedged into the new edition of that book. And so we'll have all of that covered. But moving on, and I see a number of questions swing on by, and Chuck is, I think, is trying to answer some of them as I speak. But keep in mind, and I saw a question raised earlier, the questions that you're going to put in the comment box or the chat box in the bottom left, we will try to address while this thing's going on. Granted, I'm trying to do like 5 different things as we do this. So what we do with those questions is we save them all, and all of your questions from the past webinars have been saved. And then we combine them into what's known as a frequently asked question sheet. And somebody asked earlier before we started, well, what happened to the questions from the first webinar? I quite literally have that open in a window on my computer and was addressing those before we signed on here. And I'll continue to do that after I'm done here. I might grab lunch. But nevertheless, we're working on those almost as we speak, and we hope to get those questions, at least for the first webinar, answered here within the next week or so. We have all the questions from the second webinar all ready to go to be answered, and I'll be doing that probably in the next couple of days as well. And then we'll take all of your questions from today's webinar. So if we don't get a chance to address it here, I don't cover it in what I'm going to be talking about today, please feel free to continue to ask questions in that chat window. And we'll leave that chat window open as we did for the last 2 webinars after we're done here. And you can continue to ask your questions, and then we'll grab all of those, put them all together, and then CRPA will be putting out the answers to those in the next couple of weeks. But turning to the first issue that we're going to talk about today, the lending of firearms. The lending bill, AB 1511, really changed, and let me back up half a second. I was really surprised that this bill in particular grew a lot of attention once it was passed, and a lot of concerns from the firearm community, partly because I guess there's some misunderstanding with respect to its scope, what it limited, and what the restrictions are under California law. And basically what we're talking about here for purposes of this bill is the change of one of the penal code sections that has to do with lending of firearms. Under current California law, and this will be California law until December 31st, you were able to infrequently lend a firearm to someone you personally know for a lawful purpose for up to 30 days, provided the recipient of that firearm has a firearm safety certificate or an unexpired handgun safety certificate if the firearm is a handgun. So basically, if you have somebody you personally know, you could have, and you still can until the end of this year, loan them a firearm for up to 30 days. And again, provided you don't do this frequently, loaning that is. And so what the law did, and this new law did, was change that restriction, basically removing it and narrowing its scope. And so the personally known exception that I just mentioned goes away and limits it to, you still have the infrequent requirement, but the loan is limited to spouses, registered domestic partners, then you have your parents, children, siblings, grandparents, and grandchilds. Again, for a lawful purpose, not for more than 30 days. There is an additional requirement that the handgun be registered. That is a little bit disappointing because not all handguns are registered to their owners. They can still be lawfully possessed if they're not registered to their possessor. But nevertheless, in order to avail yourself of this exception, the handgun would need to be registered, and then of course the recipient still needs that firearm safety certificate or the unexpired handgun safety certificate if the firearm is a handgun. But that's basically all the bill did. It narrowed that one exception under California law, but all of the other exceptions, and I'll talk about them here in a second, are still there. And so there are exceptions on the books that still exist under California law. Those haven't been changed. The AB 1511 really only, and basically it did, narrowed the exception for the personally known loan of firearms exception to transferring the firearm through a licensed firearm dealer. And as we all know, or at least should know, living in the great state of California, that for almost all intents and purposes, and if you want to transfer a firearm to somebody else, you typically have to go through a licensed firearm dealer, known as a private party transfer in California. There are some limited exceptions to that. However, one of those exceptions here being, at least under current law, was the personally known transfer, personally known loan exception, and as of January 1st of this coming year, that personally known language gets changed and requires it to be a family member or a spouse or registered domestic partner, as I lay out there. And we've used infrequent loans twice. What is infrequent? Well, it's a phrase specifically defined under California law. Infrequent requires if you're transferring handguns or the transfer involves a handgun, you can only transfer less than 6 of those a year. And then for firearms that are not handguns, it's occasionally without regularity, which is horribly phrased and very broad in scope, and I dare say vague. But nevertheless, that's the restrictions or what the law defines as quote-unquote infrequent. And so, like I mentioned before, this came as a bit of a surprise to me because a lot of people did freak out about this exception, and we got a number of calls saying, well, what if I go to a range and somebody wants to use my gun, and am I violating California law if I loan that person my firearm while I'm there, or if everybody's sitting in my house and the person wants to check out my gun? Am I violating California law by that? No. Partly because there's still, and there are the exceptions, a number of the exceptions to the loan restrictions are still there. You still have an exception for being personally present when you loan the other person the firearm. There's still a hunting exception for long guns if you're loaning somebody else a firearm while engaged in hunting. While at target facilities, there's still an exception to the transfer requirement for loaning a firearm to a person at a target facility. And then, of course, because we're in California and Hollywood's within a stone throw away, you always have an exception for the movie industry and the entertainment industry. So a lot of the exceptions, all, I dare say, of the exceptions that were present in California law, with the exception of the infrequent loan to someone you personally known, all of the other ones are still present. And so if you want to make sure that you fall under an exception, and I would suggest that you do, whenever transferring and or loaning a person a firearm, just confirming with California law that your loan or transfer is in compliance with California law. Always double check that, or just be aware what exception you're going to be using when loaning or transferring somebody a firearm without going through a licensed firearm dealer. We do go over all of those in the California Gun Laws book. It's in Chapter 4 of that book. We have even a handy-dandy chart. Actually, I don't think we have a chart for that one. I'd take that back. But nevertheless, all of the exceptions that could apply for the transfer of firearms or the loan of firearms without going through a dealer are discussed at length there. So for purposes of this, and like I said before, people have reacted a lot with respect to this law. Don't freak out. And there are still a number of the exceptions that were there before will still be there now. The theft loss reporting, kind of silly, partly because there's already a law that prevents you from falsely reporting your crime to law enforcement. And it's not a requirement that you report the theft loss of your firearm. It's a restriction on you falsely reporting the theft loss of your firearm. So under this law, and Governor Brown had in the past vetoed similar laws that required you to, if your firearm was lost and stolen, to report it lost and stolen. That bill didn't make its way through the legislature this year. However, the false reporting bill did. And basically all this bill does is it makes it a crime, and like I said before, it was always a crime, for you to falsely report the theft of your firearm, because theft, well, is a crime. The other restriction and the other requirement of it, though, is that you can't falsely report the loss of your firearm. And so the restrictions we're discussing here for purposes of this new law makes it a crime for you falsely to report the theft or the loss of your firearm. The additional concern with respect to this law is that second round bullet point there, that if you are convicted of this violation, it's a mandatory and automatic 10-year firearm restriction under California law. That is pretty much the real teeth of this law, that if you falsely report the theft or loss of your firearm, not only are you subject to misdemeanor criminal prosecution, but upon conviction, you can be I'm not going to say you can. You will be prohibited from owning and possessing firearms if you're convicted of that code section that makes it a crime for you to falsely report the theft, loss of your firearm. Again, moral of the story, as discussed at the bottom, just don't falsely report the theft, loss of your firearm, and you have nothing to worry about for purposes of this new restriction. I'll talk about Newsom a couple times here. I'm talking about it right now, partly because Newsom's initiative, again, on the ballot this November, is more broad in its scope. And specifically, it does have a requirement that if you lose or have your firearm stolen, you have to report it to law enforcement once you know or reasonably should have known that the firearm was lost or stolen. And you're required to do that, as it says right there, within 5 days. You are likewise, if you discover your firearm, wait a second, it wasn't lost and wasn't stolen, I done found it. It was hiding underneath my bed. You need to then report back to law enforcement again that, oh, sorry, I know I reported lost or stolen, but I found it, and you have to do that within 5 days as well. This restriction doesn't apply to antiques, and there are some exceptions for law enforcement if they report it to their agency. Same thing for the military if engaged in their official duties. FFLs are required to report the loss and theft of firearms to ATF, and so they're exempt from this restriction provided they follow those federal requirements. And then, of course, we're only talking about firearms that are lost and stolen after July 1st of next year. And so bear that in mind when you're making a decision to vote for Newsom, that this is what the expanded scope of the Newsom Initiative will do for Californians and under California law, and the violations for these violations if you fail to report the theft or loss of your firearm. It's an infraction for the first couple times you do that, but on the third time and any subsequent times, it's a misdemeanor. And then, of course, while it's an infraction for the theft loss reporting in the Newsom Initiative, it doesn't prevent you from getting charged under different code sections. And like I said, there's already a code section that if you falsely report a crime, that they can charge you with that. So this, despite the fact that this law makes it a crime to do a false report of the theft or loss of your firearm, they can charge you under this new law and the existing one. NDAs from time to time will typically do that just to make sure they have all their bases covered in prosecuting a person. So keep all of that in mind when making the decision with respect to Newsom, that it's broader in scope than what the current California law is, and would require you, upon knowing or should have known that your firearm was lost or stolen, would require you to report it to law enforcement within 5 days of you knowing or when you should have known that. The large capacity magazines. Being a California resident, you should, or I would hope, be aware that there are already a slew of restrictions on large capacity magazine. Well, one of them, at least not under state law, is a ban on possession. There are some jurisdictions that ban them themselves, ban large capacity magazines in those jurisdictions, but at least for the time being, there's no statewide ban on the possession of large capacity magazines. Well, that's going to change. July 1st of next year, it will be illegal for you to possess a large capacity magazine. And I don't think I defined it there, which is an oversight on my part, and for which I apologize. But essentially, the large capacity magazine is any ammunition feeding device with a capacity to accept more than 10 rounds. There are a few exceptions to that definition, but for almost all intents and purposes, if you have a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds, it is considered quote-unquote large capacity, and your possession of that magazine will be prohibited under California law as of July 1st, 2017. And as I kind of lay out there, there's no grandfathering, there is no consideration for you who have been in possession of that magazine for years and years and years and years and years to be able to continue to possess it. Unless you meet an exception, and there are very, very limited exceptions to this restriction, you will be required not to possess it, or either get it out of the state, turn it into law enforcement, sell it to a dealer, or if the firearm is, if the magazine is modified to hold no more than 10 rounds, it's not considered a quote-unquote large capacity magazine. So that will be an option as well. And as I say at the very bottom of that, the Newsom Initiative also will have a restriction on large capacity magazines I'll touch on in a second. But I do define large capacity magazine. Thorough writing by me. Nevertheless, July 1st, you're going to see right there that you got the ban on large capacity magazines. It does not include the feeding device permanently altered to hold no more than 10 rounds, your 22 cal tube ammunition feeding devices, and a tubular magazine that's contained in the lever action firearm. All of those three exceptions to the definition of what is a large capacity magazine is unchanged from current California law. It's still there. The restrictions and the sentence, or what you're subject to if you're found in violation, is laid out there as well. The violation is going to be an infraction subject to a fine, and depending on whether or not it's your first, second, or third, or thereafter violation, the fines are laid out right there. If it's your first violation, you get an infraction with a $100 fine. Your second violation is $250, and then your third and any subsequent violations are going to be $500. But it is an infraction. Infractions don't carry with them typically firearm restrictions, and infractions, for lack of a better definition, are akin to a traffic ticket and something along those lines. And so you have that by way of punishment for your violation of the possession of a large capacity magazine. And this is a somewhat important distinction. The possession is going to be punishable as an infraction. Current California law that restricts the manufacturing, the importing, the keeping, offering, exposing for sale, the buying, giving, lending, receiving of a large capacity magazine, those punishments for those violations have not changed. and those can range from either a misdemeanor or a felony. So all of the activities under current California law will still be restricted, and the punishments for those violations are exactly the same as of January 1st, 2017. Come July 1st, 2017, the restriction on possession comes into play, and remember that one is an infraction, just so be mindful of the distinction and watch out for the differences. Some exceptions, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm not going over all the exceptions because there are a lot of exceptions to the restriction. The one that most people, well, it's very hard to have a firearm as discussed in that first bullet point, but for lack of a better exception, most Californians aren't going to fall under any of the exceptions that currently exist under California law for this restriction on possession. But if you are, and you do, happen to own a firearm prior to January 1st, 2000, that's no magazine that holds fewer than 10 rounds is compatible with that firearm, you'd be able to use that large capacity magazine solely with that firearm. I'm unaware of very many firearms that meet that definition, but if you do have one of those firearms, you've had it since January 1st, 2000, and the only magazine compatible with it is a so-called large capacity magazine one, well, congratulations, you won the large cap mag lottery. You're going to be able to keep that one provided you use it with that firearm. Beyond that, the exceptions for law enforcement agencies currently exist will still extend to the possession. Sworn peace officers and now sworn federal law enforcement officers will be able to and be exempt from the restrictions on large capacity magazine acquisition and possession. I emphasize the sworn federal law enforcement because, believe it or not, under current California law, there is no exception for federal law enforcement officers to import or acquire large capacity magazines. That was an oversight and has been an oversight for years and years and years under California law, that there was no exception for federal law enforcement pursuant to the restrictions on large capacity magazines. However, DOJ, for most intents and purposes, has basically turned a closed eye to that restriction, but nevertheless, they will now be exempt under the code come January 1st, and so they will be able to acquire, and then of course they will not be subject to the possession restrictions on July 1st for large capacity magazines. We had a question before, and I think Chuck addressed it, but those of you who were not present when he did, retired sworn peace officers and retired sworn, previously sworn I should say, federal law enforcement officers will be exempt from the possession restrictions. They are not, retired officers are, exempt from all of the other restrictions. So they're not going to be able to buy and import and manufacture large capacity magazines. They're only going to be able to possess them once they retire. So you members of law enforcement, buy as many of those as you can prior to retirement. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek, though not really. And so you can possess them afterwards, but you're going to be only limited to, or you're going to be exempt from the possession restrictions upon retirement. And then last but not least, and as I've mentioned before, a lot of the other and currently existing exceptions for large capacity magazines will be present for the possession ban and will extend to the possession restriction once it goes into place, keeping in mind, and the one note I made at the bottom, they deleted the restrictions on bringing those magazines into California if you'd lawfully possessed them in California to begin with, which is rather odd because, as I say 2 bullet points up, retired law enforcement is going to be exempt from possession only. However, with that deletion of the exception from being able to take large capacity magazines out of California and bringing them back in, it would appear, the way this law is written, that if retired law enforcement officers wanted to take their large capacity magazines outside the state of California after the ban is in place, they're never going to be able to bring them back in. And so that is a weird deletion when it comes to these restrictions, and a potentially problem for retired law enforcement officers who, under the exception that will go into place next year, want to continue to possess their magazines, because it would appear that once they're outside the state, those retired officers may never be able to bring them back into the state because there's no exception for them to do that because they would be importing them back into the state. It's a weird distinction and one we had assumed that the legislature may clear up. They never did, and so we'll remain to be seen what happens with that exception. How to comply with the law? Well, the law outlines 4 things, and you see them right there for those of you in possession of large capacity magazines right now. Get them out of Dodge, get them out of the state, sell them to a licensed firearm dealer prior to July 1st, 2017. Take a hammer and a hacksaw to them and destroy the heck out of those is the next option, and then surrender them yeah, right, to local law enforcement for destruction. Again, if the magazine doesn't hold more than 10 rounds and is permanently altered in that configuration, it's not a large capacity magazine. So keep that in mind, and as I had mentioned once before, but it bears repeating, there is no grandfathering. As with assault weapons, if you had an assault weapon from years and years ago and you didn't register it as an assault weapon, or if you have a firearm that's going to meet the definition of an assault weapon next year and you don't register it and you don't reconfigure it so it's not an assault weapon, it will be considered an assault weapon and it will be illegal for you to possess. There's no grandfathering. The state doesn't care about how long ago you acquired this thing or how lawfully you acquired it years and years ago. There's the restriction. The restriction is thus. If you possess it after the date it's made illegal, and you're done. And they're not going to care that much about it. Law enforcement's not going to want to hear too much about it. And trust me, I've talked to my fair share of district attorneys who are prosecuting cases similar to these. They don't want to hear it as well. And so just be mindful of that in moving forward and be well aware of the consequences if you choose to continue these magazines. And since I mentioned assault weapons, if you possess and want to continue to possess a firearm that's going to meet the definition of assault weapon next year and you don't want to register it and you don't want to reconfigure it to be so-called California compliant, be well aware of your exceptions and be well aware of what you're getting into, because there could be potential problems with respect to your future ownership of firearms, or for at a minimum you're facing some pretty hefty fines if you're possessing more than a couple large capacity magazines. I mentioned the Newsom Initiative once before, and I'll mention it again. The Newsom Initiative has a restriction on, again, so-called large capacity magazines. It, too, will go into effect July 1st, 2017 if the Newsom Initiative passes. Slight difference, though, when we're talking about Newsom. Notice that it's not just an infraction for possession of a large capacity magazine. It can also be charged as a misdemeanor violation of California law and a fine if you're in possession of a large capacity magazine. So bear that in mind. If under the current law, it will only be an infraction for possession. For Newsom, it can be a misdemeanor. And the options laid out in Newsom's initiative are very similar to the current California law. The California laws will be on January 1st, 2017. You can get it outside the state. You can sell it to a licensed firearm dealer. You can surrender it to law enforcement. But like I said before, and I would remind you again, that if you permanently alter the magazine that currently holds more than 10 rounds into a configuration so that it cannot hold more than 10 rounds, it's not by definition a large capacity magazine. And to sum up some of these dates I've mentioned before, the false theft loss reporting comes into play on January 1st. That also would carry with it, if you violate the false theft loss reporting, that on January 1st of next year, you could be facing a 10-year restriction from the date of conviction. The lending exceptions I had mentioned before, the personally known exception as it currently exists under California law will go away on January 1st of this coming year, and the infrequent exception for loaning firearms to your family members will come into play on January 1st of this year. And then last but not least, for the large capacity magazine, federal law enforcement officers will be able and be exempt from the restrictions on large capacity magazines come January 1st, 2017 with this law goes into effect, and the ban goes into effect on July 1st, 2017 for large capacity magazines. Next part of that is there's links to the bills. I typically find the bills simply by just Googling California legislature and then the thing I'm looking for to give you insight into how I look these up myself. But nevertheless, there are links there to all of the bills that have passed and will be California law come January 1st, 2017. And then that about does it for today. It's a quick one for today. You don't have to hear me droning on and on for purposes of this. I hear Chuck coming in on the background. The other thing I don't think either one of us have mentioned just yet, we are preparing and in the process of preparing one of these webinars to discuss the full scope of the Newsom Initiative. I've touched on that previously in the ammunition webinar, our second one, and of course I did that again today. But we'll be talking about the scope of the Newsom Initiative, what it does, how it contradicts or is contrary to the laws that have recently passed. You can expect that webinar to come out probably towards the end of next month because there's a lot of information to put together. But we are planning one of those in the foreseeable future concerning that, and so people know what they have to worry about or what they're voting for come November. And then, like I mentioned before, and I see a hand raised from earlier today. I'm sorry I missed the question, but if you do have questions, then we may sit here and hear sighing. But nevertheless, if you do have any additional questions or concerns, go ahead and continue to fill them in the chat box. We will go ahead and
Joe, before we sign off.
Oh yeah.
Joe,
yes.
Folks are asking some very practical questions. They're trying to figure out, I can see from the questions they're asking, they're trying to figure out, well, what do I do with these? What are the options? They can sell them out of state. They can sell them. They can turn them into police, which I hope no one does.
You can literally turn them sell them into state. Yes, to a licensed firearm dealer. Licensed firearm dealers are still exempt from the restrictions on acquiring large capacity magazines within the state. They themselves, of course, are going to be limited with respect to whom they may transfer those large capacity magazines. But if you can find a dealer who is willing to take them and willing to give you some moolah for it, by all means, if that's an option you want to avail yourself of, that is an option until July 1st, 2017. At that point, it's illegal for you to possess it, and any dealer in their right mind will probably turn you away if you walk into their store on July 1st and say, here's my large capacity magazines I kind of forgot about. Do you want to buy them from me? At the very minimum, that dealer should be turning you away. That dealer may also say, hey, law enforcement, there's somebody here trying to sell me things that they're not allowed to have anymore. So
yeah, because the dealers are going to be very nervous about getting caught up in this, but the in-state dealers. But you can then, at that point, still sell them or get them out of the state. The big question that folks are asking is, what does permanently altered mean? If they want to keep them and turn them into not more than 10-round magazines, how can they do that?
Well, the current modifications, and keep in mind that that permanently modified language is still what is the defining language under California law. So all of the things that you can do now and people do now to import magazines that would typically hold more than 10 rounds, and then they modify them prior to bringing them into the state and do those modifications legally, you would be able to do so for purposes of these. So again, pinning them, putting a rivet into them so they could not physically accept more than 10 rounds, and you could not modify you cannot change that modification without darn near destroying the magazine. All of those modifications are still available for you as they are today, and they will be until July 1st, 2017. Come that date, if you're still in possession of a large capacity magazine and it's been unmodified, you, my friend, are going to be in violation of California law.
A couple other things to clarify for folks.
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, no, I was just for clarification purposes. And again, those modification techniques that are available currently under California law will be available until that date for you to modify your magazine.
Okay, a couple other questions. Isn't this a taking? It's not legally considered a taking, but essentially this is confiscation of a firearm part. with some slight political legalistic nuances which really make no difference, because the property that you possess now and legally acquired and have legally possessed, you're not going to be able to possess that property in the same form. So from conventional wisdom, it's a taking. Only a court could come up with a way to distinguish it, because you can arguably sell it out of state at some kind of a, they're not worth much out of state, but that basically means it's not legally considered a taking of your property. Another thing that people are reflecting some misunderstanding about, this is with respect to assault weapons. When you register a firearm, and a lot of handguns have been registered for many years, long guns more recently when you purchase them, but they're not registered as a quote-unquote assault weapon when you buy it in the store. You have to separately register it with the DOJ as a quote-unquote assault weapon in order for you to be able to possess it in that form. Keep in mind, you need to consider your magazines and your rifles separately. You need to determine whether or not your rifle is an assault weapon by doing the analysis that we go through in the assault weapon webinar. You need to figure out whether or not your magazine is a now prohibited 10-plus magazine by doing the analysis about the magazine. Just because your assault weapon is registered and legal to possess because it's registered doesn't mean the magazine that originally came along with it is legal by virtue of the fact that the rifle that it came with is registered. It's a separately prohibited item. You need to consider them as separately regulated items and do the analysis separately. And the other question a lot of folks were asking is the possession of multiple magazines simultaneously that hold over 10 rounds, is that going to be multiple separate offenses? And I think the answer to that is yes, even though they have, this deal, a certain fine for the first offense, fine for the second offense. If you have several with you, they'll probably stack those. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it would be my opinion as well that they would probably try to stack those. You may be able to negotiation, try to kind of consolidate those.
It'll become a plea bargain exercise.
Yeah, that is my understanding of the way it's written. I would need to double check that, and that would be something we'll address in the frequently asked questions for purposes of this one and get an absolute clarification with respect to that. The other portion there being is that we are in the process and we do address the confusion relating to the registration of the firearm upon acquisition and then the subsequent and the required so-called re-registering the firearm as an assault weapon. And you've been checking that on with respect to that. No matter if that firearm is in the automated firearm system and already registered to you, if that firearm then becomes an assault weapon next year, you will need to register that firearm as an assault weapon at that point. And so, and that does not apply to those firearms that you've already registered as assault weapons. They're already assault weapons registered to you, and this is not an amnesty or waste for somebody to register firearms that were already, as the law is right now, to register those firearms. And again, be on the lookout if you possess a make and model firearm that is an assault weapon. You should probably talk to an attorney about that situation, but your registration of that firearm, which you cannot have lawfully possessed in the state of California, depending on its make model designation for quite some time, that will probably get you on DOJ's radar if you attempt to register it for these new firearms that are considered assault weapons under the new law as of next year.
So we're going a little bit afield. I know all this stuff is interrelated and very difficult to sort of segregate, but we in the interest of time and also trying to make it understandable, we separated all that out. So all the questions I'm seeing roll up now about assault weapons, please watch the assault weapon webinar that we've posted now. It should be more easy to gain access to on CRPA's website. If you pre-order the book and get that preview, and I apologize we can't distribute that one for free, but there's probably 400 attorney hours in putting that thing together. And the money goes to a good cause. The CRPA will put it to good work. We're doing everything we can to fight back against this. I know it looks like we're getting our butts kicked up in the Capitol. and in some respects we are, but it would be a lot worse if CRPA, NRA, GOC, and the other groups hadn't been fighting this for the last, well, I've been doing it for over 20 years, and they've been doing it, CRPA and NRA have been around over 100 years. So the power of those groups comes from guys like you, folks like you, being engaged, informed, and making the calls to the legislature and the governor. And right now there are a couple bills sitting on the governor's desk, so it's time to make those calls. If you check out the CRPA website, they have the contact information and the news bulletins about the bills that were sent to his desk yesterday. So do what you can. We appreciate your involvement. We appreciate your interest. Again, if you have suggestions for future webinars, I'm ready, willing, and able. NRA and CRPA will put those together for folks as part of their service to California gun owners. Just send us something at contact@crpa.org with your proposed subjects. And I think that's about it.
I would add one thing by way of the information that we're going to make available. A lot of the questions still scrolling through there are being covered and will be addressed under the frequently asked questions thing that CRPA will be sending out. Those of you who have signed up previously for that webinar, we've got your email address. So we'll be sending you those frequently asked questions directly. They will also be posted on CRPA, probably on the webinar portion of that, but a lot of those questions that are that are being asked in the comment section are already being addressed. And like I mentioned before, I literally have that window open on my desk where I am writing through the answers to all of those questions that CRPA has put together and accumulated from that first webinar. And then at that point, if you don't see your question specifically addressed and or you buy the book or you have additional questions that you would want an attorney to address, we can go through that process. Just keep in mind that in doing so, you're going to probably incur a little bit of a cost because unfortunately we can't address everybody's question when they call our office to ask specific questions about their issues. But keep in mind that's why we're doing free webinars. That's why we're answering frequently asked questions for free. That's why we have a 26-page, $26 book currently, and I think it's going to be a little bit more expensive this coming year because it's got way more information in it. But we are putting all this information out and it's available, and a lot of the questions asked can be addressed any one of those ways. But last but not least, if you have a specific question to you that you don't see addressed in anywhere else, you can reach out to our office and an attorney will address that, but keep in mind that that does cost a fee.
Let me just end with this, guys. The NRA and CRPA have asked us and other lawyers that we work with all the time across the country, Second Amendment lawyers, to look at these laws and come up with every and any legal challenge that we can. We have several. Many of those may involve the DOJ and the way they interpret these laws and try and pass regulations to effectuate the laws. But there are, let me put it bluntly, if Donald Trump wins, there will be Second Amendment lawsuits filed against most of these laws that have been passed this year and in previous years, because he will put a favorable Supreme Court in place that follows Justice Scalia's line of thinking and the wisdom that Justice Scalia put out in the Heller decision. But if Hillary Clinton gets in, she's going to stack that court with judges who read the Second Amendment the way the recent en banc panel in Peruta read it and the way that a bunch of courts across the country have read it, to try and pull the Second Amendment's teeth and make it basically useless in stopping infringements on the right to keep and bear arms. So the stake of gun ownership and the ability to own the guns that you choose to defend yourselves and your families really is to a large degree at stake in this presidential election. So whatever everybody can do to get out and vote, to get everybody else out to vote, even if we don't win California, sending a message and showing that kind of a turnout for Trump and getting your friends in other parts of the country involved. It's not going to just be for 4 or 8 years of the next presidential term. It's going to be for 40 years of the next the life of a Supreme Court justice who's appointed for life, and they'll put a young one in so that they have a long term. So the stakes are high, but the CRPA and NRA are working very hard and will do everything they can do to fight these in every way they can fight these. Litigation, grassroots, and you're the key to that one, and lobbying in Sacramento and every place else. So thanks again, everybody, for listening, and please help us help you by doing your part in all that.
Okay, and last but not least, guys, if you continue to have questions after we've signed off, feel free to continue to put them in the chat box. We're going to leave that open for like 5-8 minutes after we've signed off, and we'll go ahead and get all those put together and potentially address them under the frequently asked questions stuff that we'll be putting together probably within the next couple of weeks. But that's it for me. Take care, everybody, and I'll look forward to having you all in the chat room when we discuss the Newsom Initiative this coming month. Take care. Bye.